So welcome everyone. Welcome back to Celebration 2021. Last year, the pandemic forced us to scrap Celebration altogether. And now actually we are virtual event specialists, particularly thanks to some of our friends at CEN. Anyway, we're so glad you could join us. For those of you that who don't know me, I'm Zach Schulman. I direct the Entrepreneurship program at Cornell. And I'm actually at my Cornell office today, which is a rarity. I only been in maybe 5 or 6 times since last March. It's about 49 degrees. I'm looking outside and looks like a hurricane here in Ithaca today. So before we jump in, I'd like, as always, to thank our sponsors and our advisory council members for giving us all the support that they do throughout the year. Like I mentioned yesterday before we started, we simply cannot do what we do without our AC members and corporate sponsors. So thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank the team at E@C and also the Cornell Entrepreneur Network for making Celebration happen. Okay, let's get started. We have 4 sessions today. A fireside chat with Bob Langer, a fireside chat with Stephanie Carton and Courtney Spritzer, the finals of the Student Business of the Year competition, and then a very special honor very special hour honoring Chuck Feeney. And I'm really looking forward to that. Throughout the day, you will see Heather Willems from Two Line Studio. She's going to be drawing online. So you actually won't be seeing Heather. You'll just see her iPad drawing our events as they happen, similar to how we do it at our New York City conference in the fall, Eclectic Convergence. I also want to remind everybody, don't be shy about Q&A. The goal is for you to put your Q&A into the chat box. That will then show up for me in a separate mode, and I will try to get to Q&A, a lot of it throughout our sessions. Okay, so first up is Bob Langer, and I'm delighted to introduce both Bob and the Dean of the Engineering College, Lyndon Archer, who will be moderating the session. Both Bob and Lyndon's bios are on the Celebration website, but here's my own personal spin. So Bob is a biochemistry superstar. Hey, Bob. Whose impact on the biotech world is actually immense. How about these quick factoids? 1,400 patents. Yes. He's co-founded 40 companies. Yes. 8 of those 40 are worth over $1 billion. Check. He's the most cited engineer in history. I'm not even sure what that means. It sounds like it's huge. Check. He's the Cornell Entrepreneur of the Year for 2015. I remember that presentation. That was a lot of fun down in New York City. His award list is just simply too long to even comprehend. Of course, he did receive his PhD from Cornell. And yes, he's the co-founder and chief science officer at Moderna. Bob, I did get the Moderna vaccine. I'm past my 2nd dose. I think just next week will be my 2-week mark. So clearly, in my book, he gets hero status, and I think most of us would agree with that. Like Bob, Lyndon is also a chemical engineer. Lyndon's been at Cornell for over 20 years. He's currently the dean of our engineering college. And importantly, at least to me, Lyndon has started a few startup companies, primarily in the battery and energy space. Thomson Reuters recognized Lyndon as one of the world's most influential scientific minds in material science. And that sounds like it's a very meaningful honor, Lyndon. So let's get started. Lyndon, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you have some pre-set questions that you'll be running through with Bob, and then I'll be popping back on the screen with some Q&A. So when you see my video pop back on, that's your signal. Okay? So right, go ahead and take it away. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thanks, Zach. And Bob, thanks for doing this. I mean, it's truly an honor to sit with you here and to do this via Zoom. So look, just to get started, I want to hearken back to a famous quotation in a 2017 Harvard Business Review article about you titled "The Edison of Medicine," where you famously advised a graduating PhD student on the way to academia in the following words: do something that's big, do something that really can change the world. What I would like to do in today's conversation is to drill down on that advice, to understand its source, to understand what inspires you, to get some insights on the key lessons you've learned over a tremendous career, to get some thoughts on the process by which you decide, which technology should be translated to the market, your core values that guide these choices, your tips about fundraising, how you deal with failure, and much, much more. In short, we will speak about all things entrepreneurship. So Bob, again, welcome back to Cornell.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you and all of you, and it's an honor to be here. It's always a pleasure to be at Cornell, even virtually.
So let's begin at the beginning, all right? So you graduated, as Zach indicated, with a bachelor's degree in 1970 from the Smith School of Chemical Engineering here in the College of Engineering. What attracted you to Cornell in the first place?
Well, really, I mean, it's going to sound simple. It was the best school I got into, and I really wasn't that sure about what engineering even was. I really am almost embarrassed to say when I was in high school, I was good in math and science, and my guidance counselor, my dad, told me, well, then I should be an engineer. And it really was hard for me to figure out because I thought engineers ran railroad trains, and I wasn't really clear why being good at math and science was so important for that. But Cornell, had a very good engineering school, and they were nice enough to let me in. So I went there. I'd gotten a Regents scholarship too, which was helpful. I don't know if they still have those. Those are state scholarships. But yeah, so I felt very fortunate to go there. It was hard school too.
Yeah, I know. So considering what you just said, right? Because it was a hard place, and you wouldn't have thought, the first thought in a student's mind is to pursue a career in academia, yet you did. So when did you decide that that was the path to take?
Boy, that's a long story, but I'll go through that. So at Cornell, I was I was doing work, and really at the end of the 4 years, or near the end of the 4 years, I did apply for some jobs, and the jobs I got were running like chemical plants in North Dakota. Not that the North Dakota part wasn't as bad as the fact that I thought that anybody would hire me to run a chemical plant. I probably would have been a disaster. I would have had it blown it up accidentally. So I thought, well, I better, think about this some more. And I applied to graduate school, and I ended up going to MIT, and I did research there, but I really wasn't that excited about the research. I helped get involved in helping start a school for poor high school children. And I really enjoyed that. I got involved in creating new chemistry curricula. So anyhow, when I was done with MIT, I applied. Everybody that year, this was 1974 at MIT, everybody that year pretty much got all these fantastic high-paying jobs in oil companies, and those were my good friends. I thought, well, I'll do the same thing. So I applied to oil companies. I got 20 job offers, 4 from Exxon alone. And, really, I wasn't that good, but they just had so many openings. So anyhow, I wasn't very excited about it. I remember going to one of the Exxons, and one of the older chemical engineers said, gee, if you could just increase the yield of this one chemical by 0.1%, that would be wonderful. It'd be worth billions. And I remember flying back to Boston thinking, I don't want to do that. So at any rate, I looked for, I tried to look then for other kinds of things. Because I had done the chemistry curriculum and helped start that school, I actually started to think maybe I could help people, in developing new curriculum, which I was interested in. But one day I actually saw an ad at City College of New York to do that, assistant professor of chemistry, to develop chemistry curriculum. But I wrote them, and they didn't write me back. But I thought, boy, that could be a useful thing. And so I found all the ads I could to do something like that. I found about 40. I wrote them. None of them wrote me back. But at least it stuck in my mind, like, well, now I want to do something with my chemical engineering education to help people. And so I started thinking about medicine as another route. So I applied to a lot of hospitals and medical schools. And they didn't write back either. But one day, one of the people in my lab mentioned to me to write to this man, Judah Folkman, who was a surgeon at Children's Hospital. And he offered me a job, and that really changed my life. I was the only engineer in the whole hospital, and I started seeing all these medical problems that MDs were trying to address, in sort of standard medical doctor kind of ways. And because I was a chemical engineer, I started thinking about it very differently. And I had all kinds of ideas about how I could, make new materials, make new drug delivery systems, make new tissues and organs. And, and I realized that, that actually now that I had some ideas, being academic and that I like teaching, that academia would be something I'd really want to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I think, so there's a saying that someone wise shared with me a long time ago that basically says, closed doors also provide direction. And this sounds like a very interesting example of doors closed that actually led you to exactly where you needed to be. So it's pretty impressive. So the students in the audience, I'm pretty certain, looking at your trajectory, looking at what you've done, listening to Zach's comments, you've won literally every award possible for someone in your field. When you look back at your Cornell education, I mean, what stands out in terms of providing the preparation that, has led to such excellence?
Yeah, well, I got a great education at Cornell. It was tough. They had moved when I was there, 66 to 70. They had just converted a 5-year program to a 4-year program. But I had great teachers and great role models there. In fact, I still remember some of the things that I learned there today. I mean, and a number of the professors. I mean, George Shealy was a professor, taught me heat and mass transfer. And then my senior year, I was his teaching assistant. And that was a fantastic experience. He was just a great person, but also I loved being a teaching assistant. It was the first time I really had done something like that. And I really enjoyed working with the students. And I felt I was, I felt I found something I was finally good at. And so I really enjoyed that. Bob Finn, he was doing some biological work, and I did my thesis on damaging blood and trying to understand that better. I mean, it was probably a terrible thesis, but at least it got me to, start thinking about research and maybe even bioengineering. I remember I remember Peter Harriet, we had this course on unit operations. And, one of the things that we did, I probably don't remember anything about the unit operations, but what I do remember is the technical writing. Yeah, and he made such a point of telling me, and I'm sure others, about don't put in any words that you don't need. And, and that I still use some of the lessons that he taught me today, and lots of other people too. Ray Thorpe, and also, so I think that really the classes, the teachers, my friends who were, I got to know, like Dave Charlton, who was in my class, and others I'm still very friendly with today. And so in fact, we just had our 50th reunion, which we did by Zoom too, not that long ago. And so it was very, very nice. So I think it was a lot of that experience, my experience at Cornell from an educational standpoint was terrific.
Well, you made the important point about communications. And one of the things that maybe the audience doesn't know is the ancient history in chemical engineering, where in the unit operations courses, the grades were basically, you got 2 grades, right? You got a grade for your technical part and a grade for the writing, and your score was actually the product of those 2 grades, right? So 2 70s would be a 49. And it really did, I think, to your point, Bob, hammer home the lesson that you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't communicate them in a way that's impactful, they're not good ideas.
Yeah, no, I mean those classes were really transformative for me. And a lot of times when you're taking them, you don't realize it completely. But it really made a difference as I look back today at the things I learned and the people I met.
No, that's awesome. So look, so going back to that bit of advice, which I hope you remembered, right? Do something big, do something that can change the world. When I think about that, those two things aren't necessarily equal, right? Meaning they don't necessarily intersect. That there are many people who are doing big things that would never change the world. And I think the translation of those big things into products, into the market, entrepreneurship, in other words, is actually the crucial glue that sometimes matters, right, between a good idea and one that can change the world. Now, obviously, in the 1970s, this perspective was not maybe the common perspective, yet you did that. Yet you decided from almost the outset of your career to partner deep intellectual research, fundamental research with entrepreneurship. And so some thoughts and what led you to do that? What drove you there?
Yeah, well, it wasn't. Actually, that's a great question, and actually, it's not a simple answer. I really didn't know, but as I was telling you about my search for jobs, it became clear to me, as you pointed out, I started to learn what I didn't want to do. That was really important, and it's a lesson that I keep telling my students today. Even if you didn't like the place that you went to for an interview, you gain something by learning what you don't want to do. So finally, when I did go to Judah Folkman's lab, the lab at Children's Hospital, I was the only engineer there, and he had what I'll call really big ideas. He had this idea that if you could stop blood vessels growing, you could stop cancer. And I contrasted that to some of the things that I had seen earlier, you know, at MIT, where I felt people were doing what I call kind of incremental mathematical modeling of things that I didn't really think would change anything. And by the way, I didn't know that he'd be successful or I'd be successful at trying to create these substances that could stop blood vessels. But I felt, boy, if you could do that, it would make a real difference in the world. That said, I did a number of things over the first couple of years when I was at Children's Hospital that I felt were important. Not only the studies on the blood vessel inhibitors, but actually developing the first drug delivery systems for large molecules. Something that actually even becomes important today with the COVID vaccines. It was the first time that had been done, and people didn't think you could do it. But at any rate, I published papers. I was very naive. We published a paper on each of those things, one in Science and one in Nature. And I was naive enough to think, geez, if I publish papers, people will use it. Well, boy, that is certainly not true. So at any rate, I would keep working on this stuff and hoping people would try to use it. And, some academic people did. They used the techniques, but it really didn't lead to products like you said. So probably after about 10 years of doing this, or maybe 9, I got a call from a multi-billion-dollar animal health company, International Minerals and Chemicals, and they had read some of my papers by then, and they said, "Well, gee, they'd like me to consult, and they're going to give me a grant, and and I mentioned, and we had a patent by then, and so they said, would I do that, and can they license the patent? So anyhow, they did all that, and that got me very excited. Next year, Eli Lilly, another multi-billion-dollar company, they had read some of my papers and the same thing, and they gave me another grant, asked me to be a consultant, and they were going to develop this for insulin. I was very, very excited about that. But Lyndon, after about, they kept, they would do a little bit of work and each of those companies, and the experiments didn't work out the way they wanted, and so they just gave up. So that really saddened me, because I thought, here the stuff was going to get used. So must have been about 1985, 86. Alex Klebanoff, who's a very good friend of mine, he was in the same department and later in the chemistry department at MIT. He said, "Bob, we should start a company." So we did. And we started a little company, and first 4 of the people at the company were my students, and they cared a lot about this. And we also made a license to another tiny company on a polymer we developed, and with them we helped develop both those companies. We created products, one that's still used today for treating brain cancer, others that are used for treating schizophrenia and opioid addiction. And I could see that what was amazing to me was that these tiny companies, like, they they could make such a difference, you know, and the difference was is they had this belief that you could do it, and so I just kept doing that, you know, and that was a great experience for my students. It was a great experience for me, and it's led to products, you know, that are used all over the world. So I think that those 10, 12 years of moving from trying to do just science to wanting to see that science actually make a difference. I mean, that's sort of how I got there. And I learned some really important lessons about what not to do.
Now that's a great segue, because I want to fast forward now. And as the audience heard from Zach, you've started or co-founded some 40 companies, and I'm pretty certain that's a conservative list. It's probably more like 50. And that is impressive already. But the statistic that I am most blown away by is that almost all, you know, made it through the so-called valley of death. And I think all but one at last count were still active. So there's got to be lots of tips and tricks that you can share with this audience, especially persons in the audience trying to be among the 10%, right, of typical startups that make it. So can you share with us, you know, some of your tricks, tips? You know, how do you select leadership? How do you decide when to translate? That sort of thing.
Sure.
And actually, hey, just let me interrupt for 1 second, Bob. As you're answering that question, if you could also explain how you navigated the university administration when it came to you, a faculty member, starting companies. This is a very it's a topic that a lot of people care a lot about, and it's always a little bit confusing. You have a full-time faculty member starting companies. How are those conflicts handled, and how did you at MIT, you know,
Sure.
basically navigate that with the university administration?
And especially Zach at that time, right, when this
Yeah.
was not at all commonplace.
Right.
Well, those are good questions. I'll do my best on those. So I guess the rules I've sort of, again, subconsciously, I might have had some ideas on it, but I'll tell you what I view as the rules now, which you could sort of envision as tips. You know, one of the biggest mistakes I think people do today, and I'm sure I've done it too, is start companies too early. You know, you just get so enamored with wanting to do it, and the students have seen some of these big successes, including Moderna, and you know they want to do it. So at any rate, you know, the rules that I've used is that I don't want to start it too early, and I also want to have, and not everybody might agree with me, but I guess I'd say first I want to have what I call as a platform company. You know, that we make a discovery, and you can use that same discovery over and over again, probably with the same manufacturing procedure, and just exchange drug A for drug B for drug C. And that's, I think, really important in the sense that medicine in particular, biotech, is just such an expensive thing. We've done some non-biotech companies too, but most of them have been biotech or medicine. And medicine, you know, Tufts, I think, estimates it costs $2.5 billion to create a new drug. And nothing in medicine is cheap, and nothing in medicine is fast. So, so I think so one thing is to have these platform technologies. John Maraganore, who's was a CEO of Alnylam, a company I was on the founding scientific advisory board of, and they've done terrific. He basically says, you know, you want to have a plug and play. You know, that's simple, but plug and play for you know, biology. So you have a different drug and you put it in the same nanoparticle or very similar nanoparticle. I mean, that kind of idea. So at any rate, that's one. Two, that we've published it, and we've made it public at least once, and we've published it in a really good journal that attracts a lot of attention, like Science or Nature. Three, that we have a really good patent, ideally what I'd call a patent that's a blocking patent, which doesn't sound nice, but blocking means that prevents others from doing it. If you don't have that, you at least want to have freedom to operate, and you want those patents to be as broad as possible. Four is that you be fairly far along, even, you know, like you have at least good animal data to give you a proof of principle. Five is that we probably, and this is more from the university standpoint, but most all the time I've done it, when I look back, there were students in the lab that wanted to do it because they've spent 4, 5, 6 years of their life working in a lab on these things.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I think are really important for these companies are champions. Like I would trade people who are willing to walk through walls for experience most of the time. I mean, in a way you want both, but the students who've worked on these things, they're I mean, the passion they have, because they've spent such a part of their life on it, means a lot. And so that's also been an important thing. So I would say that those, to me, have been the rules for starting it out of the lab. But that being said, there's lots of other things that are important to making a company successful. One of them is having great partners, because I'm a scientist. I've learned something about business over time, but believe me, I'm not a business person, or even close. So I've been very fortunate, and I sort of learned this the hard way too, to work with investment firms like Polaris and Flagship, in particular, are two of the big ones in the Boston area, and they, and we've had a really good partnership. And one of the key things that's very, very important, I think probably the most important for these companies, and as a scientist, I wish I didn't say this, but I do, are the business people, the CEOs. I mean, the ability of the CEOs to really create a business vision, to raise funds, to manage all this stuff. And it's very complicated because you have to keep raising money. And it's not like you're raising money in biotech based on sales, because it takes a long time to get those sales. So, and you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So having great CEOs, to me, has also been absolutely crucial. So I'd say those are some of the things that I've learned, and but it really is a partnership. When these companies succeed, it's a team effort. I'm part of that team, but I'm hardly the only person or even the most important player. I think the investors, the CEO, a lot of times my students. I mean, I think it's really having the right team.
Yeah, that's awesome. So to Zach's question about the university, so was that straightforward in terms of cultivating a climate where, the leaders saw this as an opportunity for MIT?
Yeah, I'm sorry for not going over that. That's a great question. I would put that down into 2 or 3 parts, and this answer may not be what even you or Zach were looking for. But I felt, MIT had a pretty good culture that way. They did not discourage me from doing it. They did have, I think, a very good technology transfer office. And, and I think that to a certain extent, even then, some people would say that, the spin-off companies were a good thing. Really, the thing, and this is what I was going to say that might be surprising, is that, whenever, maybe it's not surprising, but what I would find, and it was very subtle, is that if you did something that got you publicity, this is me as a faculty member, or made money, or at least seemed like it made money, a lot of other faculty would get jealous. And and actually, Judah Folkman, who I mentioned, I'll make a side story just because I think it's just so relevant, and he deserves the credit for this. He actually, when I went to his lab in 1974, in 1975, he got the first giant grant from industry. It was $23 million from Monsanto to do this angiogenesis work. Before that, I think the biggest industrial grant was maybe 100,000. It was like huge front page headlines everywhere in 1975. At any rate, I remember about 20 years later, he got asked to give this dinner speech. And somebody asked him, well, what were the advantages and disadvantages of that grant? And he said, well, let me do the disadvantages first. And Dr. Folkman is a very humble man. He said, but anyhow, he said, well, he said, there's a gene, he said, that a lot of professors have. He said, that gene is not expressed directly. He said, it's always expressed indirectly. And he said, that gene is called jealousy. And he said, and what they would do is people would write, and they did in Science and other journals. They said, well, Dr. Folkman, he's he can't, he's isolated factors, but it doesn't, he's not purified them. They're never going to do any good. Of course, all these things were wrong. I mean, angiogenesis inhibitors have become a huge area. But nonetheless, lots and lots of negative things about him. In fact, part of it cost, he was a practicing surgeon as well as a researcher, and they actually, because of a review, had him stop doing practicing.
I see.
So I think that and I've watched this in faculty meetings. too, but it's a very subtle thing that sometimes when people have gotten publicity or even there's the appearance of making money, now they're coming up for tenure, coming up for promotion.
Yeah, yeah.
And people they don't say, well, Joe or Linda or whatever has done bad work. I mean, or that's made a lot of money or got, they say, well, there's this wrong or that's wrong. And I think
see.
and I think it's not and I've just seen that happen. And so I think that, to me, the jealousy thing, which happens in subtle ways, is and fame does that too. People may or may not know. Jonas Salk, he invented the polio vaccine. The National Academy of Sciences, a lot of times people think is one of the highest honors in the country. I mean, National Academy of Engineering, which you're in, is a very high honor. Jonas Salk, he never got elected to the National Academy of Sciences. So jealousy is something that I think more than the administration saying not to do it, but it's very complicated. And conflict of interest, I should say that's become, issues on conflict of interest have become more and more, trying to think how to phrase this. Well, there's more and more paperwork that has to be done. I think
Yes, bureaucratic. It's structured.
And different schools have had different rules. MIT, I feel like, I mean, my policy's been total disclosure, but geez, I spend enormous amount of time filling out forms, and I mean, it's just, and it becomes in different ways. Like now, you're supposed to put these things in journals. And by the way, the rules on conflict of interest, I don't know how you feel it is at Cornell. I mean, I should know this better, but it keeps changing. When I was in the board of trustees at Cornell, we had lots of discussions. But I would say it's hard for me to think of any university I've seen, MIT and Cornell, and everyone, where those rules aren't vague. I mean, it's like you're supposed to say whether you might make money. I mean, it's almost impossible, to really know what the words mean if you dig deep. And so I do feel conflict of interest is very complicated, and lots of schools have different rules. I mean, MIT has you fill out these forms, and they might have, and they have some people look at it, in the administration. I think MIT is as good as it gets. I think they've done a really good job, but it's not perfect. And I'd love to see the companies that I've started give our own lab funding, because I think we could help them, but that is against the rules. So
I think as more faculty are doing this, right? I think this has become, I tell my colleagues here at Cornell, it's one of the sort of blowback benefits from the bet that got us Cornell Tech, right? It is creating a climate where entrepreneurship is valued. And in fact, in the Cornell Tech example, a core part of the mission of the university. So I think we're getting better. And as more of our junior faculty demand it, I think we will get better. But I want to go back just slightly. I know most in the audience want to hear about the Moderna story, and so we're going to get there in a minute. But I want to go back to this jealousy thing, because I could imagine a young faculty member in the audience, a young person in the audience. This is real, right? This happens. So how do you find mentors in that kind of climate? And how did you find mentors?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's also a great question. I really don't think I had that many great mentors when I was, well, Judah Folkman was a great mentor for me, my postdoctoral advisor, but he wasn't at MIT. And there were people at MIT who were helpful to me, Mark Carell, Charlie Cooney. But I would say, by and large, the people who helped me the most were people my own age. I'll tell you a story. It's like that when I was, and the two people who helped me the most were Mike Marletta and Alex Klebanoff, and they were both about my age and at the same stage. But the story I was going to tell you is, when I was a junior faculty member, the senior faculty all of a sudden had this idea. They said, we need to have junior faculty give presentations, and then after that we'll have a nice dinner and we'll all get to know everybody much better. So Alex and I, Klebanoff and I, we were amongst the youngest people there. And we were assistant professors. So they usually have the associate professors who didn't have tenure, talk first. And Alex and I noticed, okay, they gave the talks, and then the full professors, they gave them a really hard time. And then we started noticing that one after the next, I mean, MIT was very tough. One after the next didn't get tenure. So, so Alex and I would say, well, okay, we have to give this talk. We're going to rehearse each other and make sure these talks are as good as possible. And so he was, and I still remember Alex is a really tough guy. I mean, I'm not. I remember one time Alex, they must have had 25 things on a slide. And I said at the end, I said, Alex, this is just too much on the slide. And he got really mad at me. He said, I really want to have all those on the slide. But anyhow, it was, but eventually I think it got down to about 20. But I think that it was, so I was really lucky that I had Alex and Mike Marlette. Actually, Chris Walsh was an older person in a different department, was very helpful to me in giving advice too. But it was, it wasn't so easy. To that extent today, I try to go out of my way to, try to be there for my students. I mean, whether they're at Cornell or other places, so that they can hopefully, because I really do think mentorship is very important. But I mean, that's sort of how I got it.
No, that's great. I think Zach has a couple of questions from the audience.
I do. Thanks a lot, Lyndon. So when I look up slightly, I'm just looking at my other screen to read the questions. So following up onto what you've already said, Bob, how do you see medical school culture needing to change to encourage more entrepreneurship? Is it, for example, is it an honor to publish and teach, but maybe not commercialize?
That's an interesting question for which there's not a simple answer. And I do think it varies depending on the school. And it also depends on the person. I remember in 2012, the New York Times wrote an article on what I was doing for entrepreneurship. And I remember it was very sort of surprising. It was a very nice article. I mean, the woman was very nice, but I got letters from different faculty on that. I think the dean at the UCLA Medical School and the dean at another medical school, they wrote to their entire faculty after that, why aren't we doing more of that? And so it's clear that some people want to do it. But medical school is more complicated than just MIT or Cornell Ithaca, because, if you are treating patients and you are involved in a company, I mean, and I remember seeing this happen at Harvard once. There was a guy who was started an ophthalmology company, and then he was treating patients with some of the things that they were doing at the ophthalmology company, and there was an accident, and I mean, that was not real good. And I think anytime people see one bad thing makes any school gun shy, and I think that, and there's no question that the news media and sometimes people in Congress, when they see something negative happen, you get a lot of bad publicity. I mean, the school gets a lot of bad publicity. So sadly, it's things like that, the media and sometimes Congress. I mean, and I understand why it's done. I mean, clearly you don't want to have conflict of interest, but but I think the good that can come out of the things that entrepreneurship can do, whether it's at a university or at a medical school, are good. But I think the bar is higher for medicine because doctors treat patients, and if patients, get something that the doctor could make money on, the connections are more straightforward in terms of how everyone will look at it. And then if there's an accident, it's pretty bad.
Right. Let me give you one more that's not related. As an accomplished scientist, how did you acquire the business skills for creating and running companies? And if you hired people to manage the businesses, what critical skills were you looking for?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I have any great business skills. I mean, I really don't. I mean, I think I have some big ideas. And by the way, I think I know a lot about some of those elements that I mentioned. Like,
yes,
we've tried to do cutting edge science. I certainly have made a premium on having great intellectual property, both when we do it at MIT and when we do it at the company. So those things I can bring to the table. And I also think I can pick out good scientists and work with those scientists to do great things. But like I said, the business part, I've really relied more. I mean, I help, but I'm hardly any expert. I've really relied on partners like Terry McGuire, Nubar Fayan, who are at these venture companies, Amy Schulman, and they are much better at this, I think, than I am. And so I think they rely on me to a certain extent to try to make sure we get good scientists and good patents and maybe good regulatory things. But they help me a lot on the business side, and including the people that run the company. Now, in terms of running the science part of the company, I mean, that's something so I've never run a company. I mean, I've never done that. But I certainly have been an advisor, close advisor and board member to many companies.
Yeah.
So something more like that, like a team effort.
It's interesting. You mentioned Flagship already, and as being an example of a VC firm that is truly a company builder. And it's interesting because just a month ago we did a webinar with Leslie Linewan, who you probably know. Leslie, she's at the University of Colorado, and she's very much like you. I mean, she's a science founder of a couple of really huge companies, and they had the same type of experience with their VCs, where the VCs built the businesses. And it's rare to find VCs that do that as efficiently as you mentioned, Polaris and Flagship. I think Third Rock is another one based in Boston. I'm sure.
We've done a lot with them too. I mean, they're also excellent.
Yep.
Especially when Mark Levin was there, who was a good friend, and Mark, he's CEO of Millennium, and he was outstanding. So
right.
A lot of it, by the way, depends on the particular people at the fund.
Correct.
So when I think about Mark and some of the others, and like I said, Terry, Amir Nashad at Polaris, who was one of my, Nubar, these people are very, very good at it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Bob, we're gonna fast forward to the present, right? So we're on Zoom, but many of us are looking forward to being off Zoom, at least, to choose to be on if we want to be, right? And the Moderna story is a key part of why. Now, you've had a role in founding Moderna, so can you just tell us a little bit about that story? I mean, what is your role? Where do you see the company going? Obviously, to the extent you can tell us the details.
Sure. So I'm happy to do that. Well, like I say, in a way, I mean, the story for Moderna, from a science standpoint, for me, really goes back to that paper I mentioned that we wrote in Nature in 1976. It was the first time you could create tiny particles like micro or nanoparticles to put nucleic acids, among other things, in, and RNA is a nanoparticle. And then we'd published other papers over the years, making those things better and better. Other people did too. And in 2001, another company that I got involved in, being on the founding scientific advisory board of, was Alnylam. And Alnylam was going to try to create, and has, siRNA therapeutics. It's almost the opposite of messenger RNA. This is shutting the gene down. And they hired one of my students, Kenna Kink, and he led one of these projects, still does. And they started, we talked a lot about the right delivery approaches. And one of the things that we came up with and actually helped them on, published and patented on, were lipid nanoparticles. And,
I see.
And so they worked with a group in Canada, Peter Cullis's companies, and by, as well as ourselves. Anyhow, by 2018, 17 years after, which might sound slow, it's actually very fast in medicine, but they got the first siRNA drug approved, and it was in a nanoparticle for a rare disease, what's called ATTR amyloidosis. At any rate, now let me go back to 2010. So Alnylam was going on. 2010, a young scientist, Derek Rossi, came to see me, and he, several people that knew me said he should come to see me, both for, I think, the delivery stuff, as well as to, possibly, create something. And he had done some important work on messenger RNA. And one of the questions we started asking, that he was interested in, is, could we start a company that could make therapeutics out of messenger RNA? And then we got Ken Chen involved, who was a cardiologist, and Nubar. So that was 2010. And really, we spent, I'd say, maybe the first 6 months in my office or Flagship's office, brainstorming about patents, about strategies, nobody was at the company yet. Then we got a little bit of lab space and we got things started. We hired a couple scientists. Then Newbar mentioned to me, well, of course, it goes back to what I said. You always want to have a great CEO. And Newbar knew Stefan Bonsell, who was the CEO of Pasteur Maria. I actually knew him too, because I'd done some consulting for them. And he said, well, what I think if he could get him to be CEO? I said, gee, I was really impressed with him. So Newbar talked to him, and he came on as CEO. And, and we just kept going from there. We had visions that you could use messenger RNA in nanoparticles. You had to put them in nanoparticles because they'd get destroyed if you didn't. So you have to protect them and then deliver them. It doesn't necessarily need to be a lipid nanoparticle, but it needs to be some protective vehicle. At any rate, and lipid nanoparticles, look good, though we've looked at others too. Anyhow, we just kept advancing the science in terms of doing things in small animals, larger animals, and we had this plan that we could use it for rare diseases. There's a couple of advantages I think that we recognized early on. I certainly thought about this. I think we all did. Was that that if you had RNA, just to take a step back, hundreds of companies, Genentech, Amgen, lots of others have made protein therapeutics companies. But the central dogma, but if you make a protein therapeutics company, it takes a year, maybe more, to make that protein therapeutic. You need a lot of chemical plants. If you're doing vaccines, you might need a ton of eggs.
To deliver it, right? To deliver it.
Yeah. But it also the manufacturing is brutal. It takes a long time, all kinds of things. Whereas there's a central dogma of molecular biology, right? DNA makes RNA makes protein. So if you had the RNA, you could just give the RNA in the nanoparticle and have it make the protein. So that would be tremendously faster. You could make the RNA in a week or two, just inject it into the body, and the body rather is almost the plant. It's making all the protein from the RNA. So at any rate, that would be one advantage. Another advantage is that you'd be getting it into cells. And so there are diseases, like often rare diseases, that are intracellular. So here's a way that we could, make all kinds of proteins much faster, probably much cheaper, which certainly would be important for vaccines and other things. And secondly, you could treat a whole host of diseases that you could never treat before, intracellular diseases. So these were some of the advantages. So, we put up, here's what we're going to go after, and, try to think about different things that we might do. So we thought about rare diseases that were intracellular. We thought about vaccines. Certainly not COVID at the time. I think our first thing in the clinic was a flu vaccine, still something we're working on. But Stefan not only was a visionary guy, he was able to construct very good deals. And this probably also, when you asked about tips, I think is an important thing. So we had, again, a platform technology, right? You could use messenger RNA for almost anything. So after we got the human primate data and non-human primate data, we made this deal with AstraZeneca. And the deal was we'd give them 40 targets for heart disease, but just heart disease. And they'd give us $280 million and another $180 million broken up into 3 milestones if we were able to do certain things, like deliver it or manufacture a certain amount. And, so that was, close to $500 million early on for the company. And yet all we really did was give away heart disease, which is a huge deal, but still gives you the right to do cancer, rare diseases, other things. And so that's what we did. We'd give pieces away. We did certain infectious diseases with Merck, certain rare diseases with Alexion. So we give pieces away, but that helped finance the company. And we also were able to raise additional money. At any rate, we kept going and going. And, by 2018, we went public. It was actually the largest biotech IPO in history. And also, again, I think when, a lot of times when you read the news media, they say, well, the government's funding all of this. Which is a ridiculous statement. Really the people that deserve credit are the investors. The investors and those companies put in billions of dollars to Moderna. And because of that, we made the conscious decision, and I think around 2015, 2016, to build a giant manufacturing plant.
Yeah, yeah.
And that really, we made it to make these vaccines, and in particular cancer vaccines, which is another project. But because we had that built, now comes 2020. And as you pointed out, all of a sudden there's the corona problem.
You're ready. Yeah.
Yeah. So Stefan recognized this, got everybody working on it. And, really in a couple of weeks, we had the prototype for the vaccine. And because the investors put in so much money, we had the manufacturing plant. All the government stuff came much later, which certainly was very, very important. But we had all the infrastructure in place to do this, and we had, a reasonable number of people to do it. Still ended up.
Hey, Bob, did you say in a couple of weeks?
Yeah.
You had the prototype for the vaccine?
Yes, because that's the beauty of the messenger RNA. Basically, you have the spike protein that's going to go after, and you could design an RNA, that would encode for that spike protein. That's sort of like, so basically, yeah, it was, I think we were able to probably start the clinical trial, probably within 2 months of this. I think if I remember correctly, we started in March of 2000. Yeah, we were the first.
And were you personally involved in a lot of that effort during that, what I'll call the crunch time?
So yes and no. I mean, I have 2 roles at Moderna. I'm on the scientific advisory board. I'm on the board of directors. So I'm certainly involved, but I think we had a lot of people, like I say, everybody there was working 24/7. But yeah, I was involved, certainly at a high level by being on the board and being on the scientific advisory board.
So my, what I'm impressed by, Bob, is that I've not heard a more clear and more convincing articulation of a business model that meets a platform technology than the one you just gave. And I'm now thinking, so what are the limits, right? Because you can literally just, divide diseases up and decide, I'm going to pursue this in this sector, this in that sector. So what are the limits? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think there's many parts to that question. And by the way, Moderna is not the first time it's been done. I mean, Genentech, when I was an advisor, they did that, specific drugs for companies, and then on their own. Alchemies, which is based on a lot of our work, did that. I mean, so this kind of model, I think, is a pretty good model. I think Moderna's done it very well because Stefan has done a great job. But so it's not the first time it happened.
No, but I'm after. I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm after the mRNA aspect. I mean, because that is a game changer, right?
Yeah,
the simplicity of making, the simplicity of delivery, versatility.
I think it's pretty unlimited. I think that's going to be a big part of our future. It's faster. It can allow you to do things that you couldn't do before. I think certainly we'll see more and more treatments based on messenger RNA. I don't, I mean, and of course, because of the success of Moderna, not just Moderna, BioNTech as well, I think we'll see more and more treatments, combination vaccines for any kind of disease, treating rare diseases, possibly, I mean, this is more a dream, but we're working on this too, is cancer vaccines.
I read about that. Yeah, I read about personalized even.
Yeah, personalized vaccines,
yeah.
exactly. And we're working on that. There's clinical trials that have already started. Again, as we and others understand the biology better, a lot of these things will get better and better. But I think it's a giant. It will change. I mean, it already has, given what's happened with the COVID vaccines. It provides a whole new way of thinking about creating medicines, as you correctly pointed out, Linda.
So we can go on for hours. I just know it. I mean, this is incredible. So what I want to do is to just sort of zoom out a little bit now, right? And ask you about sort of rapid fire things, sort of proudest achievement, biggest failure kind of things, and overall advice for people listening.
Sure. Do you want me to do each of those 3?
Go for it in whatever order you prefer.
Well, I always say my proudest achievement is my students. You know, I feel like, I mean, I've done pretty well in a lot of things. A number of people have. I still think my students have done better than anybody else's students anywhere in the world. I think 400 are professors, including I think about 6 at Cornell, and
Yep, yep.
you know, well, you know a lot of them, if not all of them, a lot of others have started companies, you know, or have high positions in companies. I think something like 20 are members of National Academy of Engineering.
Yep.
I think 16 National Academy of Medicine. Several, even though they're engineers, are members of National Academy of Science. I mean, Christy Anseth, who I
Yep,
think,
yep, yep.
and I'm sure you know Cato just got
I
elected.
know all of them, and you've imprinted on them, Bob, and that's the part that's impressive to me, that you see them and see their work, and you know that's a Langer student, right? So it's, you've created an atmosphere that, you know, isn't effective just at mentoring, but in some sense in developing human capital in a certain, you know, impactful way.
Yeah, and whatever I've done, they've magnified tremendously more. You know, whether it's at Cornell or anywhere in the world. So that would be my proudest achievement. Failures. I mean, I've had a lot, so I'm trying to think which one I should pick. I've science failure. Well, I mean, you know, I had this idea not only of delivering drugs but removing things that are bad. One of the things I had an idea of was that would be bad was removing bilirubin. This was many years ago, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, because a neonatologist came to see me, and we actually figured out a way to do that using a certain enzyme, which we even published in Science. And I was excited about that. But about the same time we did that, some people came up with the idea using light. And even though I was excited about what we had done, you know, their idea is a lot better. So you know, we certainly, I view that as kind of a failure. And I've had business failures too. I mean, you know, again, it's a team effort. We don't always pick the best CEOs. And I had one company go into bankruptcy. In the end, it got acquired by Pfizer, but that wasn't real good. But I certainly have had that. There was a third part to one of your questions, though. I'm trying to.
Have I forgotten? You've given such a thorough answer. No, but I think the third part was more like a wrapping up. You know, if there, I know I asked you a lot of questions, but there might be things that I should have asked you that I didn't. I mean, so are there lessons you would like to communicate to this group, knowing that they're students, they're alumni, they're faculty in the audience, they're leaders?
Actually, Bob, I'm going to rephrase that question because somebody in the audience asked it this way.
Okay.
They said, what advice do you have for the next generation?
Perfect. All right.
Yeah, well, I think, boy, that's there's a lot of different things I could say.
I mean, they're kind of asking you to play God a little bit. I understand that, but
well,
I mean,
I don't mind trying to do that, you know, but it's so much on what people's dreams are. And I usually, what I try to say to people when I've given commencement speeches and things like that is I try to say, well, you know, it goes back to what Lyndon asked me in the beginning. You know, I try to tell people to dream big dreams that can change the world. But I've also said that if you do that, you'll probably run into a lot of opposition. I mean, in a story I sometimes tell her myself when I tried to do that, you know, and we didn't get into that much today, but geez, after I published some of those papers, I had like, people didn't believe in the work, and I got 9 grants rejected right away. I couldn't get jobs in chemical engineering departments and anywhere in the world. And so I guess the second part is, if you dream big dreams, you should be prepared to have a lot. Even if you're even partially successful, you should be prepared to have some real opposition to those dreams. And then my third part is just don't give up. I mean, I'm picking those because those are fairly generic, whether somebody is a scientist, an artist, politician, whatever it is. You know, I think you want to do something that it can be big. But if you do go down those paths, you should be prepared for, you know, a lot of people to not want you to have that kind of success.
So
yeah,
it's just go ahead, Zach.
It's super interesting. I mean, I was just thinking, like, you must wake up every morning now. Like, I mean, Moderna is probably the company. I guess I should ask the question: is it the company that's had the biggest global impact? Do you think?
Biggest global impact in terms of,
well,
of
like
your companies,
like of your companies.
Yeah, I think probably that's true. I mean, partly because this COVID crisis is terrible, but and people all over the world are using, the vaccines that Moderna is using, and all the vaccines, all the mRNA vaccines, whether they're Moderna's or not, are using nanoparticles with RNA in them. And like I say, the science of that starts, shortly, not that long after I left Cornell.
Right. It's incredible. It's incredible that it took so long, but I'm glad it's finally here. So like, I mean, do you just wake up now like with a big smile on your face every morning? Like, I mean, it's like you look around and
I did it. The sort of I did it smile.
Yeah, I mean, because I know you're really humble. I mean, I've met you a bunch of times, as you know. And
I do. I mean, I'm pleased about that we've been able to do something important. But gee, I mean, whether it's Moderna or things in the lab or anything else, I mean, there's still so many problems. I mean, you can look at the positive side, and I do that, but then I look at the negative side. Like there's all these people in the developing world that aren't getting the vaccine yet. There's problems in India, problems in Europe. And I'm just picking this narrow thing, relatively speaking, about the vaccines. And I'd like to see those problems solved too. In fact, a big part of our MIT lab is devoted to working with things at the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates has been a terrific supporter. And, we are working on more basic research on better nutrition, better vaccines, better oral systems. But I mean, again, anybody that has students, you kind of live a little bit vicariously through your students. Some are doing great, but others are, struggling getting jobs. And, as my wife sometimes says, with my children, you're as happy as your least happy child. So so I think that, and my students aren't quite my children, but they're not that far away. So I feel good about, I mean, I'm always you probably tell from this conversation, an optimist, but that being said, it doesn't mean I don't think a lot about the other things that we can do that'll make life better for people.
So I've got a final question, and this one is a little bit different from what we've been talking about. And this is, so I don't know if you know the work of Rashid Bashir at UIUC, who's thinking about the so-called physician of the future, thinking in particular about creating physicians who are engineers by training. I don't know if you've seen any of that work.
I know his name, but I don't think I've seen the work.
Yeah, so I guess the overarching question was about, what does the physician of the future look like to you, right? So you've been impacting the tools, if I can put it that way, that they can use. But I imagine that the user of those tools, if they're, maybe in some sense educated to be better users, that could also be a win-win type of outcome. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's, of course, I'm highly prejudiced for engineers, but I think it sounds like a really good idea. I think you do learn. I'll actually give you a very different example in a second of something that I thought about being an engineer, chemical engineer, rather than physicians. But and I'll come back to that in a second, just to show a contrast. But I think that to answer your question, I think it's a good idea. I think the more physicians have elements of an engineering thinking, it can be helpful, and they may think in new ways. And that'll look at the example I was going to say, that when I and this is that I personally thought about when I so going again back to the 70s, when I was working in this hospital, and like I said, I was the only engineer there, and I was, as I explained, one of the things I did a lot with was materials. So I was curious, how did materials find their way into medicine? And I was, again, very naive. I thought it must be older chemists or older chemical engineers, but it really wasn't. Almost all the time that a material found its way into medicine, it was because of a medical doctor.
Yeah.
And what they always would do is they urgently wanted to solve a medical problem, so they'd go to their house and they'd find some object that resembled the organ or tissue they wanted to fix. Just two quick examples. When people want to make an artificial heart, the people at this goes back to 1967. The cardiologists there, they said, well, what object in our house or kind of resembles like a heart, has a good flex light? And they thought about a lady's girdle. So they took the material that's in the lady's girdle, the polyether urethane. That's what they made the artificial heart out of. So that's 1967. Well, that's still the case today. Because once you start down that path, from a regulatory standpoint, it's not so easy to change. A second example are breast implants. One of those was a mattress stuffing because it was squishy. And that's sometimes created problems too. So at any rate, when I saw this, I started to think, well, maybe we could use a chemical engineering approach. Why couldn't we ask the question, what do you really want in a biomaterial from an engineering standpoint, chemistry standpoint, biology standpoint,
And build it.
Build it, synthesize it from first principles.
Mhm.
So a lot of the materials that we've created over the years have been based on that premise, and that's led us to, new materials that now treat brain cancer and other diseases. But it's a very different way of thinking for, by bringing engineering into that. Of course, now, hopefully, because of what we've done, and we've trained a lot of physicians too, they're thinking more and more along bringing engineering, whether it's into their research or into their practice.
Yeah, this is awesome. Yeah. So look, I'm not sure where we are in terms of the time, but I want to.
We still have a few more minutes. I
we do.
actually would. I got
you
a
have
couple
some
more questions.
Oh, good. Go
I
ahead.
do.
Yes.
Is that okay with you, Bob? Are you still good on time?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So besides Moderna, what are your 3 favorite companies that you've co-founded?
Well, so let's see. So there's that's always a hard question because it's like asking which of your children you love the most. You feel bad about the ones that you don't. Well, but I'll give a couple of examples that I'm excited about. Well, Bill Gates came to see me about about several ideas, and again, I'm going to give you ones that are there's ones that we've just probably founded that are early, but all the ones that I'm going to mention are reasonably advanced. So at any rate, Bill Gates came to see me, and one of the things he was interested in is, could you come up, because people in the developing world don't, remember to necessarily take their pills when they have diseases like malaria and so forth. So with Gio Traverso, who is a clinician, gastroenterologist working with me, we actually worked out a way to create pills that you can swallow and they'll actually last for a week or a month, maybe even a year. Mm-hmm. So we started a company called Lindra to develop those, and they're now in phase 2 trials, but it could fundamentally change everything, right? If you could take a pill, rather than take a shot, or if you could take a pill once and it could treat the disease, that would be, a really, I think, transformative. It would also change drug discovery because you could, change the pharmacokinetics and all kinds of other things. A second one, which actually one of my former postdocs did, fellows, is a company called Seer. This is Omid Farrokhzad, and he developed a way of taking nanoparticles, but then when you take the patient's blood, you get what's called a proteome. You get a fingerprint sticking to you get a corona. And we started this company called Seer, which is now a public company. But the beauty of this is really within an hour or two, you can get the entire proteome, which is like the genome, except it's the proteome, which is different. And like, for example, I could see that teaching you, why do you get a certain fingerprint if you have cancer? Why do some people, there's so many questions, right? Why do people, when they get injections with COVID vaccines, why do they get a reaction X or reaction Y? Or why do children not get bad reactions in general and adults do? Can we come up with an understanding of the fingerprint, maybe even specific lines of those fingerprints that will tell you new treatments? And Omid's actually even found, he's got a spinoff, which I'm on the chair of the scientific advisory board, called Prognomic, that this is it looks like a new way of doing early cancer detection. And maybe
Bob, do you think you could predict, for example, when that rare blood clot problem could come up?
That's a great question. So I don't know what it's confidential on that. I actually told him that's a very important thing. So he's actually talking to some of the people involved. You and I are in the same way. I think you're exactly right that could be a way to do that. So that's another one. We did start a company also. There's so many of them, and like I said, I'm really proud of all of them, even the ones that haven't done as well. I mean, Momenta is another company that we started that actually Johnson & Johnson acquired for, I think, $6.5 billion, but it's making new drugs for autoimmune diseases and things like that. And I mean, I could go on and on, but really I'm proud of all of them because, even when they don't, not everyone does well financially, but they've all advanced science. They've all, I mean, one of the ones that people often talk about is totally different, Living Proof, because we did it with Jennifer Aniston. But there's just a lot of different.
Curly hair company.
Yeah, but there's all of them to me are just like, I mean, I have 3 kids. I love 2 of them went to Cornell, but I love all of them. So I love all these companies and all my students. How can you not?
No, but look, an interesting thing I've observed though is your discipline. And I know as a faculty member surrounded by people who are not as successful in translating technology, I imagine there must have been a temptation to enter into spaces outside of the biopharma space, to start companies solving other types of problems, right? How did you resist that? I mean, I don't recall any of your companies straying from that very tight biopharma sector.
Yeah. Well, probably my academic research, I've strayed from it a little bit. The only company that did stray from it, I suppose, was from companies were Living Proof, just as the investors that I helped asked me to help them on that, which I did, and it was fun. But I guess the answer is I think I know what I'm doing when I'm doing the biotech stuff. Not that I'm any expert, but I at least have, with all of the failures and all the experiences, I've learned something. If I was trying to create an energy company or some other things, it would be harder. I mean, and I don't know that I'm, and I am still very interested in helping people's health. I think that's something I can contribute to.
It's a good answer.
Yeah. So Bob, I have one more question and then we'll be able to wrap it up right on time. So the question, again, I'm reading it off my screen, says, you seem to have such a collaborative relationship with your investors and that they're true partners to you. How did you go about picking your investors early on? Did you have any idea what you were looking for? Well, that's basically the question. So how did you pick them at the early stages?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. And, really my first experience with investors, I ended up actually working with some of the investors people would say are the best investors in the world, or, really top tier venture capitalists. But I didn't find the experience so positive. They really, I was so naive. I mean, they had clauses in here about participating preferred shares, which I didn't even see or know what they meant. And basically it means it's like double dipping for them, and I was really disappointed in that. And then when I started helping another company, they didn't like that either, even though the other company was totally different. So, I think the first time, I think it must have been the 3rd or 4th time I did this, I met Terry McGuire, who was at Polaris, and he was just like such a decent guy. He would put, in fact, I remember there was an interview with him once, and, somebody asked him about his philosophy, and he said, there's a rule in venture capital called the golden rule. And he said, that means that gold rules. And he said, that's not his approach. And his approach really was to try to treat people well and fairly. And, and he's done that. And so we've done probably 20 companies with him.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Who's just a visionary guy. I mean, you give Nubar an idea and he'll make it that much broader. I mean, and that much better. So I basically have largely worked with them, and I've done some with Mark Levin at Third Rock, and we certainly brought other investors in, but those have been the ones that I've sort of started the companies with. And for the most part, I mean, there's a few other examples too, but I think that it's just partly bad experiences followed by good experiences, and then you pick the people who you have the good experiences with.
Right. Well, I'm sure that Terry and your other investors also fully enjoy doing work with you on a repeat basis, because there's a certain level of, they know who you are, they know you're not going to, be doing something that's not probably going to work. et cetera. So it's surely a two-way street. And I bet you're probably like you are probably their favorite founder. I mean, that's like, I know you don't care, but it's like,
Sure, I
you know,
care.
you're probably their favorite founder.
Yeah, but and we've done a lot of things together with them. But sure, I mean, you to me, this is with another. I mean, to me, happy people having happy people that you work with, having happy students, happy partners. I mean, super important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, we're at 12:45. Linda, are you okay cutting off now?
Yeah. No, so I just wanted to thank Bob. I mean,
Absolutely.
My goodness, this is my first fireside chat, and I've got to do more of these. This is really,
Well,
this is really substantive.
Listen, so somebody wrote in the comments, they wrote, "This is the second webinar I've attended with Dr. Archer. He's a key component. He's a star."
Oh my goodness. I think that might be my wife who said that.
It wasn't. I know your wife.
Yeah, Linda, you asked great questions. I mean, really terrific.
No, well, this is awesome, Bob, and I hope it comes across that we're really, really proud of you. I mean, my goodness, I talked to the faculty about wanting to instill a culture for all-round excellence. I mean, and you take that to a totally different level. So thanks for doing this. And again, I appreciate your candor and appreciate the quality of the advice you're providing to people in the community.
Well, I
Great.
appreciate all you're doing for Cornell, both of you and all my students there, who are faculty and graduate students. So thank you all. It's a pleasure.
All right, take care, Bob.